The Berkeley Center for New Media, or BCNM, is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Tonight's event is generously co-sponsored by the American Indian Graduate Program, the Arts Research Center, the Department of Ethnic Studies, the School of Information Media Studies, the Center for Race and Gender, and Native American Studies. So a brief introduction to Indigenous technologies. In the fall of 2020, BCNM started an Indigenous Technologies Initiative to explore questions of technology and new media in relation to global structures of indigeneity, settler colonialism, and genocide in the 21st century. Our Indigenous tech events and ongoing conversations with Indigenous scholars and communities aim to critically envision and reimagine what a more just and sustainable technological future can look like. We have highlighted Indigenous engagements with fire management and traditional ecological knowledge, computer science, virtual reality, social media, online activism, video games, and more. The thinking behind this initiative would not be possible without the theorists and artists like Gloria Emeagwali, we have here today, and the leadership of Indigenous tech coordinators Marcelo Garzo Montalvo, Sierra Ed, and the BCNM staff. As part of this initiative, BCNM commits to supporting Indigenous sovereignty. We recognize that BCNM is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the Confederated villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region, as in every region, has always depended on the land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place here today on and in relation to this land. At BCNM, we commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. A quick note of our community agreements. We invite everyone to participate by responding to tonight's lecture in the Q&A box. And we ask that attendees help us maintain an inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free space. Attendees who violate any of these guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online events. If you are new to our events, please read our community agreements, and we'll share a link to those in the chat. I would also like to mention that we have captions available if you'd like to turn those on. Now, I am absolutely honored to introduce Gloria Emeagwali. Dr. Gloria Emeagwali has published extensively on various aspects of African history. She taught for a decade at Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, and the University of Ilorin, Kwara State, Nigeria. She has been a visiting scholar at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and St. Antony's College at Oxford University. Dr. Emeagwali was the founding director of African Studies at Central Connecticut State University and is currently professor of history and African Studies at that institution. Professor Emeagwali is the co-editor of, among many other works, African Indigenous Knowledge and the Sciences, Journeys into the Past and Present. This is a very rigorous, expansive work that delves into epistemology, pedagogy, physics, medicine, and metallurgy. Professor Emeagwali is also an amateur filmmaker and producer of many video documentaries that can be found on Vimeo and YouTube. Professor Emeagwali founded and maintains African Indigenous Science and Knowledge Systems, a website that presents perspectives on African Indigenous knowledge from a wide range of scholars. And the site was listed by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, as one of the top 50 African websites. She has an active presence in networking platforms like LinkedIn and USA Africa Dialogue, and is the chief editor of Africa Update. Professor Emeagwali is the recipient of the 2014 Distinguished Research Excellence Award, University of Texas at Austin, and the 2019 Distinguished Africanist Award at the New York African Studies Association. And I would especially encourage our attendees to check out the website that Dr. Emeagwali founded, African Indigenous Science and Knowledge Systems. From my just brief perusal, the website brings together such an impressive breadth of topics, from writings about African food processing techniques to a compendium of African and African-American inventors. But not only is it an incredible compendium and gathering together of resources, but also a source of rich commentary on the impact of colonialism on African Indigenous technologies. And it points our attention to the many anti-colonial activists and technologists whose work shapes our past, present, and future. And with that, let's take a moment to welcome Gloria to BCNM.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. It's quite a pleasure to be here. And I guess I would, without much ado, go into the discussion. Should take about 50 minutes. And I welcome the most challenging of questions. So let's proceed. So this presentation begins with a brief focus on some of the negative and positive features of digital platforms. The platforms are then evaluated to see which of these platforms could be used in storing, generating, and disseminating information about ancient Africa's indigenous knowledges. The concluding segment of the presentation focuses on some of the challenges confronting scholars, practitioners, platform users, and developers with respect to African indigenous knowledge systems. In the course of discussion, the presentation focuses on Google Arts and Culture, which is a knowledge sharing platform, Netflix, which is a streaming platform, and YouTube, interactive and user generated. And brief comments would be made on a few other platforms, depending on the time. The emergence of digital platforms should be seen in the context of the third industrial revolution and beyond. The shift from mechanical and analog electronics to new communication and information technologies, of course, with almost unlimited connectivity, would take place. Now, given we have different types of platforms, centralized and decentralized, with blockchain being regarded as one of the decentralized ones, whilst Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, Apple, Twitter, etc., would be centralized. And I think I appreciated the comment of Andreas Hein, who suggests that one way of distinguishing one platform from another may be to look at the value creation mechanisms, ownership, and also complementary activity. That's the user activity. The other point I'd like to make, of course, is that the definition, I think it's important to look at the definition of, what is a digital platform? Well, given the heterogeneity and the multifaceted nature of the products, of the services, the technologies, the ecosystems, infrastructure, and also business models associated with digital platforms, a one-size-fits-all definition is hard to come by. But as systems, they are online-based, interactive, commercially viable, and in most cases would involve aggregated data. They may include systems that involve media streaming, service, knowledge sharing, commercial transactions, innovations, and social media. These devices have also facilitated data capture, surveillance, control, platformization, and uncontrolled monopoly. And of course, their constantly evolving technical infrastructures have revolutionized the processes of value creation. The algorithms of hate. I hate to mention this, but this is what we are dealing with um, in some cases, because the platforms make use of algorithmic mechanisms, some of which are race-based, encouraging and leading to the globalization of racism. As Yeku points out in his 2022 work, the encoded ideologies of programmers and corporate owners point to a value-laden algorithmic system. The algorithms are not neutral. Let's, put it that way. Digital blackface, racist memes, emojis, and GIFs such as those are deployed. And we definitely need to talk about digital blackface in reaction GIFs, if I must quote Michelle Jackson in her very stimulating work of 2017. Joy Bolamwini's illuminating talk about the coded gaze and the biases in algorithms is definitely on point. What we find with the digital platforms, and remember I'm talking about the negative tendencies at this point, we find that you have surreptitious data aggregation, the privatization of personal data, the mining of human experiences for profit. And I must note that analysts such as Davis in 2021 differentiate between Facebook and Google on the one hand, and Apple, Amazon, and Netflix, for example, among the notorious FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, etc. Davis argues that whilst the first group, Facebook and Google, build their empires on the basis of the aggregation of data that is commodified and marketed, with Apple, Amazon, and Netflix, for example, the data is internalized and is used to customize user individual experiences. So we do have a difference here in terms of the aggregation of data. But at the end of the day, you are still dealing with the same tendencies. Sorry, I seem to be I'm going backwards here. All right, let's see. All right, so let's just jump forward to the question of data and Twitter. And Twitter, of course, is in the news right now. Twitter's changeover of leadership on Friday leaves a great deal of uncertainty, of course, about the direction of the company. But I came across an interesting comment by Morrison, writing in one of the, I'm not sure which of the, um, one of the publications. If you were a member of the Twitterati, your data are now in the hands of, and she, to quote her, a man known for being unpredictable and even vengeful. And she goes on to say that Twitter's privacy policy actually points out that the company may share, sell, or transfer information about you in connection with a merger, acquisition, sale of assets, or bankruptcy. In other words, the data is definitely going to be in the hands of the new ownership. And that's not particularly surprising. Now, let me go back a bit. I think we just it's gotten a little ahead of me here. But one of the points that we've got to note is that these digital uh, devices actually do, in terms of data capture, surveillance, and so on, have that kind of tendency. But in addition to that, we have this phenomena that, called platformization. And with platformization, which is now central to capitalist accumulative strategies, what we have is the undermining of national sovereignty, especially when there are no regulatory organizations. And as I pointed out somewhere here, let's see if we can get it. Platformization is actually central to capitalism at the present time. It's central to capitalist accumulative strategies, processes, and hegemony. And this deepens further the gap between emerging economies and, of course, the more highly capitalist ones. The platforms, as I mentioned before, have actually undermined national sovereignty. Although, there is a pushback. We can note India's challenge to Google over gaming, and that was just probably a week or two ago. Nigeria's legal challenge to Facebook over ads, I think that was in the first week of October. And the EU and UK's threat to Twitter of total ban or fines for illegal content, and that was just a few days ago. So there is pushback, but it's important to note that platformization as a whole has become very central to capitalist accumulation. The other thing to note, of course, is that platformization and the extensive utilization of these digital platforms would be done in the context of certain new developments with respect to labor. We have the creation of value from data appropriation and data extraction from multitudes of users, actually unknown to them in many cases. You also have the creation of new forms of digital labor with the outsourcing of content production to users. And, this point was made by Casilli and Posada. And, I was quite, happy to come across this kind of analysis. What he points out, what the team pointed out, was that every uploaded photo, video, gaming, session, anything, is actually labor. It's because and it's labor that is being appropriated by the platform owner. Free user-generated content, UGC, for short, is central in the accumulation process of the platform owner. And so what we have is the normalization of unpaid labor without worker leave, worker benefits, without leave, without retirement, etc. And granted that a few platforms have introduced compensatory programs, but most of these fall short of the actual value created. So when we are looking at some of the negative developments with respect to the digital platforms, we've got to realize that the appropriation of labor is an ongoing process. The platform owners actually put the platform users to work and they don't know it. Anyway, another interesting aspect, of course, is the question of power, the asymmetrical power relations. What you have is the overall deepening of asymmetrical power relations globally. And this is unfolding with the dominance of a few American companies. However, as pointed out by Dalian Jin in 2017, the Chinese BATTX companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, TikTok, and Xiaomi, have to be factored in as well. Well, let us move on to talk about the question of predatory inclusion. I think it's Cottam in an article written 2021 who reflects on the illusionary power and the momentary high felt by those captured by the platform. But the inclusion is predatory in the sense that, yeah, you're working for free, generally. Your data is appropriated. And in most cases, you were not really consulted. You were not aware of this. And even if you were, you put in a spot where you would just say, all right, go ahead. And so it's all aimed at profiteering from the captive users, and is something to bear in mind. And pointed out by Cottam as well is the fact that in most cases you have this attempt to conceal the reality. The exploitation by the companies is veiled by hypocritical declarations of concern and care for the customers and users. Elon Musk, right of center, I would say, in the political arena spectrum, well, he just declared a few days ago that he wanted to buy Twitter to help humanity. Really? How noble. So that is something also that we have to be aware of. We'll see that when we look at Google Arts and Culture, what they claim that they want to do and what they do actually is appropriation. Now, the precarious nature of the workforce is something to bear in mind, because on-demand, online, social networking labor is indeed pretty unstable. And we can see what's, happening right now too in the Twitter arena. I think maybe about 5,000 workers would be given pay slips. But it's not only Twitter. I mean, there is an air of uncertainty and instability with this particular situation. Leaving that though, we also have this question of mental health. And this is also of great concern, especially in the context of vulnerable users who may be triggered by the negative effects of online content. I think we have a very famous case in the UK, Molly, who, would end up hurting herself, really. And largely in the context of certain kinds of images that were sort of thrown at her. Not only that, we have some other indicators. Uh, Looking at what the psychologists say, and I did, look at a few of their reports, what we find in terms of the platforms is that the user actually is afraid of missing out. And so FOMO, fear of missing out, is something that, is should be noted, psychologically speaking. And of course, the effect of this could be on, shorter sleep time, for example. There is the recognition too that you have decreased physical activity, time disorientation, and of course, it has been pointed out, and I think Rast et al. Would make this argument in 2021, that you actually have changes in the brain's neurochemistry for the addictive, or given the addictive cravings. So those users who are addicted, who can't stay out of for a minute, going to Facebook or any of these um, social these programs, these platforms, social media, actually would be having some indications, some symptoms that correlate with mainstream addiction. So that's something of concern. And anxiety disorder, increased depression, diminished job and academic performance, and also decreased cognitive behavior because of the focus on the phone and not on the task at hand. These are among the negative trends. Mohammed Shafi Sharif, in his work on the impact of social media on students' performance, and I think he was referring to Somaliland, would argue that social media is an obstacle to learning as seen by the interviewees, the students who were interviewed. They also complained about emerging vision problems, no doubt stemming from the long hours of staring at the screen, 4 or 5 hours a day. Platforms have the capacity to weaponize existing hostilities in domestic and international conflicts. And we can pick at a few. For example, the Ethiopian Tigray conflict of 2020, whereby opposing sides on social media inflamed the situation. Myanmar's atrocities against the Rohingya population in 2017 is another case. Amnesty International considered that the algorithms of hate in terms of Facebook and the sort of critical situation that these created, in terms of having opposing sides basically tied into the platform, that would be a factor of concern. All right, so public safety, I don't think we can leave out the United States here. An interesting article, social media platforms brace for US midterm elections mayhem, came, attracted my attention. Needless to say that the major culprits for the expected mayhem are the platforms themselves. Despite some promised changes on Meta, give credit to Facebook for making some links to authoritative voting sources and talking about partnership with fact-checking sources and modifications to some of their recommender systems, but not enough. too little too late. The January 2020 mob incursion at the US Capitol is a clear reminder of the organizing and subversive power of social media. So, public safety definitely, in terms of the domestic crises, must be considered. And QAnon, has become a threat to the democratic process in the United States. QAnon conspiracy theory, of course, spread like wildfire on social media platforms such as Facebook, um, with incoherent fabrications linking Democrat uh, politicians to pedophiles, sex trafficking, and whatnot, in what is most likely a cult. Well, in the rush to publish, users in social media platforms often deploy personal information for instantaneous and probably phony fame. Facebook, for example, indirectly lures users into publishing highly personal information and publicly washing their dirty linen in a self-commodification and marketization process. That, of course, generates permanent digital footprints for the user and huge profits for the capitalist tech giant. The digital platforms, and I'm sorry to have so many negatives about them, but I'm going to switch to see what gems we could get out of this. The platforms often display very reckless disregard for free competition. And locally, the logic is to acquire rival companies, expand monopoly, and remove emerging competitors through buyouts. Now, I would say here that you would expect the government to intervene and have some regulations against such monopoly, but that's not the case. Facebook swooped up WhatsApp in 2014, Instagram in 2 years earlier in 2012. Microsoft gobbled up LinkedIn, and so it goes. And in the case of Amazon and Apple, the American political elite has failed again to rein in the excesses of uncontrolled monopoly. And I would say that this has become one of the defining features of digital capitalism and the neoliberal agenda. European regulators have been more aggressive in dealing with the high-tech giants for price fixing, antitrust violations, and so on. You have cases where Amazon and Apple prevent independent resellers from competing with each other, and they undermine the independence of external resellers. All right. So, can any good come out of these digital platforms? You must be wondering. I'm sure you're asking that. And if so, in what context? And under what circumstances? Well, we're going to talk about that now in this section. Again, I want to cite James Yeku because his work, Cultural Netizenship, that came out earlier this year, has actually confronted this issue and argued that in spite of their algorithms of domination, digital platforms have unintentionally, rather unintentionally, given a voice to the voiceless, especially through social media platforms. We might be dealing here with a double-edged sword and contradictory situations too, whereby some of the users are lured into washing their dirty linen in public and all that, as I mentioned before. But there are cases where you do have a situation where the voiceless are able to speak. And I guess that's where we can see a positive uh, angle to the whole thing. Yeku, in his own discussion, gives numerous examples from Nigerian cyberspace to make his case, pointing to the subversion, for example, of official government policy by activist users through digital entities such as memes, protest selfies, digital cartoons. They are able to make a point, to challenge power, speak truth to power, so to speak, and do it through the platform. So that's, that's one of the good things coming out of this. Michael Williams in 2021 actually suggests that the defiance of privilege is something to bear in mind too. That the social media platforms provide a space to reimagine Black bodies, explore counter narratives, to organize and build extended communities. And for Williams, possibilities have emerged for defiance of the privilege and oppression that were deployed against marginalized community members. So you have all these other negative things here, but uh, countercultural imperialism on a small scale, on a very small scale, and in spite of the platform owners and managers and so on, may be possible. In spite of their expectations for total hegemonic control, culturally and otherwise, the platforms have opened up some possibilities for counter-cultural imperialism and empowerment. And again, we cannot exaggerate this. We've got to be very careful, but some possibilities. Well, guess what? That is the space to be explored in the case of African indigenous knowledge systems. Whether in platforms such as Google, Arts and Culture, YouTube, or Netflix, or generic gaming and knowledge sharing platforms, that's the space that may be exploited. So that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to discuss some very cautionary, or give some cautionary notes about potential perils and vulnerabilities, because with all of that, we have to bear in mind all the negatives that we mentioned before, and they do show up again. But the positivities, the possibilities would be identified. And we'll also talk about what AIK scholars, scholars of indigenous knowledge systems, users, developers, and so on, would have to pay attention to. And so that brings me to a definition of what I'm talking about when I mention AIK, African Indigenous Knowledge Systems. What are we dealing with? Well, I've spent some time coming up with a definition. And this is what I've had so far. This is what I arrived at so far. That African indigenous knowledge systems comprise of a conglomerate of various disciplines. We're not just dealing with one discipline, we're dealing with various disciplines. And we are also dealing with intersecting epistemologies and value systems in societies that developed paradigms and ways of existence in ancestral lands. And I think this definition would apply to the Native American indigenous knowledge system situation as well. Indigenous knowledges are conglomerates, and they are made up of intersecting epistemologies depending on what particular area you are focusing on. Because the accumulated knowledges emerged out of trial and error experimentation over centuries. And we're not just talking about 200 years or three. We're talking about, millennia. And also empirical practices, tested empirical practices related to ecology, geography, economic, and socio-political traditions of existence prior to colonial occupation, prior to the plunder and appropriation that ensued. And so when we talk about African indigenous knowledge systems, or when we talk about knowledge systems, we must bear in mind this situation. In the case of Africa, the continent of Africa would be associated with numerous city-states, village republics that had no special relationship with any kingship, with the aristocracy, for example. But then you also have the kingdoms where you do have the aristocracy, where you do have the royal families. Just last week we had, not too long ago, the Zulu kingdom and the ruling family, the royal family, taking the spotlight. The continent would also have empires, and they would be of various dimensions, whether you're talking about the Ashanti Empire, whether you go earlier on to talk about the Egyptian back in the early ancient period. And I do have a long list here, then, 1 to 18, and that could have been doubled. And I have given the location of some of these here on this map. But Africa is yet to fully emerge from the quagmire of colonial multi-European domination that involved Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Some people don't realize that Spain would also be a colonizer in the context of Africa, especially in the area of Equatorial Guinea, for example, and the Sahara, the Spanish Sahara. The colonial era was characterized by military power. These were all the product of military incursions and intervention, military domination. And it was also characterized by psychological and psycho-religious warfare. I mentioned psycho-religious because religion in some cases would be used as a weapon in the support of the colonial invader. You have political and economic models of control as well. And they would facilitate the growth of the economies of the colonizers at the expense of the subjugated colonies. Africa is yet to fully emerge from that quagmire, but has been making progress. But I'm just saying that, that hand of colonial, that predatory hand is something that it takes time to free yourself from. The plundered artifacts, for example, would give us an idea of what we're dealing with here in terms of scale in the African context. Colonialism affected Africa's indigenous artistic productions, and not only artistic, but their technological productions. Many of these artistic productions were technological. If you're making bronze work, which would be an alloy of copper and tin, you are actually involved in a metallurgical exploration, which is technological, but you would infuse it with some aesthetic appeal. In any case, many of these would be plundered. And most museum items in Europe today, most of the African items in the European museums today were actually acquired during the colonial era, and they were plundered. They were not bought, they were taken away. And so if you look at the Musée du Quai in France, you have 70,000 African artifacts. The British Museum, 69,000. The Royal Museum of Central Africa in Belgium, 180,000. The Humboldt Forum in Germany, 75,000. The National Museum in the Netherlands, 66,000. These are 5 museums. And let me point out that you have multiple museums in each of these countries that would have African artifacts that were plundered. Take Britain. You have the British Museum, Ashmolean Museum, the Museum of Mankind. I think it's a David and somebody else's museum, and so on. I've been to them. They are chock full with African artifacts, and many of them were plundered. Luckily, the discussion is out today, this year, and there are attempts to get back some of these artifacts, but the progress is very slow because the British Museum, for example, made it very clear. I think Cameron, the Prime Minister, of a few years ago, made it very clear. If we were to give back all these artifacts, we wouldn't have anything in our museums. You said it. And the big question is whether the digitization of African artifacts would inspire European museums to return the original objects in their possession, or whether insatiable greed would prevail. Would the European museums avariciously hold on to both the digitized objects and the plundered originals? That's the question. Colonial hegemony affected indigenous communication technologies of Africa, including sophisticated tonal percussive systems that could relay messages and long narratives. The equivalent of a novel could be done by that drum because of the tonal nature and because of the nature of the language. About a dozen hieroglyphic, ideographic, and chronographic writing systems were systematically downgraded and even criminalized. It was even a crime to use them to write. I had this map of some of the indigenous writing systems of Africa. Some of them would be dated as starting in the 18th century or 19th century, but in reality, they were built on ancient symbols and ancient codes, writing codes. To what extent can digital platforms project ancient African knowledges, the systems that made Africa a pioneer in the production of steel in antiquity? And you can look at Schmidt, the work of Schmidt from Florida International. I think he, along with Schmidt, we have other researchers who have made this discovery and recognition of the antiquity of steel production in Africa. You have one of the earliest regions in the world to produce iron at around 2300 BC. I remember Professor Eret pointing to the Cameroon as one of the places where this would be done. At the same time, too, you have northern Nigeria with dates also 2300 BC producing iron. And they would be among the world's earliest producers of iron. You probably wouldn't know this, the textbooks tell you this and that. And of course, they never update the information. And I think sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes it's, you know, due to uh, unawareness of the new discoveries. And then you have Mali, which is the second earliest region in ceramics production in the world. East Asia being first, and then you have Mali, and then the Northeast, ancient Northeast, Egypt and Sudan. But Mali is way up there at 11,400 BC. Oh, actually, that should be 9,400 BC. So it's 11,400. I have to make that little change um, to date. 9,400 BC. And then you have raffia, a fabric that was created for the first time 5,000 years ago. And here I want to give credit to Professor Christopher Ehret again for, bringing this to one's attention. So the question is, can the new generations be educated about Africa's indigenous knowledges on digital platforms to build confidence, to stimulate new innovations, technologies, and Afrofuturistic projects? And so there are questions. What is the track record of platforms such as Google's Arts and Culture on the digitization of Africa's past? What kind of prospects do we have in the case of interactive user-generated platforms such as YouTube and digital streaming platforms such as Netflix? We'll make some comments on each of these. I'm looking at my clock. I hope it's 8:55. So I don't think, I don't know how much time I have, but let me just say that Google Arts and Culture would, in 2011, enter the cultural heritage industry, or rather, Google will enter the cultural heritage industry in 2011. And Google Arts Project was renamed Google Arts and Culture. And this now hosts more than 6 million digitized images of the world's art. The stated objective, of course, is to bring the world's art and culture online so that it is accessible. Of course, it sounds pretty nice, a noble altruistic project, but users from around the world on GAC would generate tons of personal data that are, aggregated, commodified, and marketed. Let's be clear about that. This, of course, undoubtedly provides a bountiful harvest for Google, raising questions about the stated not-for-profit status of the platform. Google displays and markets its cloud-based infrastructure and applications on a global scale through the project. And as it proceeds to provide online exhibitions and art collections from more than 2,000 museums around the world through digital museum artifacts and so on, of course, it's also marketing its wares. So I'm just saying that, they sound as if it's some great noble project, but it's more than that. One may see Google's Global Art Project as a sort of digital belt and road initiative. I was thinking of China here. And Kiza et al. Have described it as digital cultural colonialism. But anyway, Mali Magic is one of the important contributions of Google's, of GAC, uh, but a close look at the display reveals some very sinister attempts to de-Africanize and at best trivialize the centuries of painstaking scholarship by Malians through questionable background imagery of students on the digital wallpaper. If you go to that site and you have a look at this, you probably will see what I'm talking about. The commentators put the cart before the horse by suggesting that the city's command of trading routes across the Sahara made it rich with knowledge as well as gold and silver. Look, in reality, the gold mines resided in Mali and would be the primary source of its wealth. It's not about the trade routes. The narrations on, Mali should have been done by Malians, but that was not the case. Now, African traditional religions and its theology are reduced conceptually to magic, a word that appears in the overall title of the project. And some of the summaries of the manuscripts are trite and, whether accidental or deliberate, undermine the depth and intellectual brilliance of Malian scholarship. So what I want to say is that there is an infantilization of the content of the manuscripts, and this is not helpful. There's a sort of simplistic, patronizing approach. Unwittingly or deliberately, an Africa-centered approach to Mali is undermined. The efforts, though, to give credit where credit is due, the efforts to digitize thousands of Malian manuscripts is laudable. And these precious texts are certainly among the greatest written legacy of the continent, along with Africa's Ethiopian and Egyptian manuscripts and scrolls. On the left side, you see some these are Ethiopian manuscripts. The strength of GSC is its music and art collections, where there is more distinct African agency. And the collections of GSC are at their best when they employ thematic displays. Disparate, random images without a central focal point or a context are less successful and perpetuate the static colonial anthropological model. Google's launch of a 5-year investment plan worth $1 billion on October 5th, 2022, points to new directions. And probably we are going to get some good things out of this. The expansion of the continent's internet bandwidth through its various Equiano subsea cable and so on, and also promotion of a new cloud center in South Africa should be noted. We also have the expansion of speech recognition algorithms too. And so we should expect some good things. I have some recommendations though. There should be open disclosure to users by Google of the use of data extraction and monetization sensors and value creation devices. This should not be hidden. Transactions with agencies, consumer research companies, and the media should be openly disclosed in the interest of transparency and to provide the user with full awareness of the platform's ecosystem. Truth and openness should be prioritized over hypocrisy. The Digital Museum is a credible mechanism for disseminating information about ancient African knowledges, so long as it is purged of Eurocentric dogma and involves genuine African collaboration and control in the context of enlightened post-colonial paradigms. I don't know how much time I have left. I would like to know, but I certainly would like to continue to focus on YouTube, which was acquired by Google in 2006. It is the most successful platform with approximately 2.5 billion users globally. In Africa, there are about 500 million internet users and about 135 million subscribe to YouTube. Well, there have been good news, bits of information about connections, fiber optic submarine cable systems, and so on. And Facebook, Google, Orange, Vodacom, and so on have been involved. But the business model of YouTube is centered around user generated content provided by complementers or users who create value for free, as I mentioned before initially. Now you have the introduction of some monetization principles. And so it's a sort of hybrid cultural commercial space, according to authors. The whistleblowers, though, have pointed out that the recommender algorithms on the YouTube platform are designed to keep users online for as long as possible, just to get revenue. And then, of course, you have situations with YouTube and the alt-right. I wouldn't go into that. You also have live video streaming, which, that has facilitated citizen journalism and intensified interaction between YouTube's amateur videographers. Then, of course, you have the vloggers who invite us into their bedroom, chat about their personal lives, what they had for breakfast and dinner, their favorite video games, jewelry, and all that, and the day in the life of the aspiring platform celebrity. Of course, provides a lot of good, anthropologically useful behavioral data. But we have to note that in terms of accuracy of information on YouTube, there are some problems. And that can be a problem for the content creator on African indigenous knowledge systems, because you do have inaccurate stuff there as well. And you don't have a vetting process. And I think that's the biggest problem we have with YouTube. And so YouTube has been accused of information pollution and disinformation, not only in terms of hate speech and extremist narratives, but also in terms of normal discourse. So for the creator of AIKS, there is a daunting task. Many viewers on YouTube are programmed into liking short, cryptic, superficial video expressions, shallow discourse. A 20-minute video is an eternity. Juicy, sensationalist, narcissistic, partly pornographic, anti-intellectual tropes are more likely to attract mega viewers than an excursion into Africa's ancient past. Let's be honest. But Africa content creators have to push on, should not be daunted by this reality. And by making, learning from, paying attention anyway, to what some of the positive models are, I think something could come out of that. So I wanted to know, okay, these guys who are getting millions of viewers, what's the story behind it? So I saw Super Eye Patch Wolf, Casually Explained, and Tail Foundry with between 50 million and 150 million views. And what I discovered was that they integrated a lot of cartoonish, robotic characters along with an occasional F word in the case of the former. But I spotted one that can be of use for AIK. Griffin Johnson's Armchair Historian. That's the stage name, so to speak. You have a lot of information in a lucid, fluent voice, deals with a wide variety of solid history and some substantial viewing public. However, this is the work of a collaborative team of experts, inclusive of animated cartoons and whatnot, but it's doing very well. And I would say that content creators of AIK on the YouTube platform must therefore be aware of the challenges in terms of attracting viewership and armchair historian is probably a good model, although it is the product of extensive teamwork and not one individual. In the case of Netflix, um, you have a platform founded by Hastings and Randolph in 97, um, 220 million subscribers by October 2022. In the African case, you're dealing with about 2.6 million subscribers. The business model is pretty much um, like, unlike Google and Facebook, it does not commodify aggregated data. And this is good. Its model is similar to Apple and Amazon. Recommendations, however, this is one weak spot with Netflix. The recommendations to viewers are based on ethnic affinity classification. And that's a method accused of racial profiling that could diminish exposure to other cultures. In other words, if they see that, you are within, let's say, African American community, they're not going to let you see, or the recommender is not going to push you on to look at something from, say, South Asian. And that's bad. What we want in the world is uh, interactive sharing. And so one of the major vulnerabilities of the ethnic affinity classification model of Netflix should be noted. Netflix uses a crew of translators, dubbers, and so on, and focus groups. And true enough, it has been queried by local cinematic folks. In terms of Africa, Netflix, the question is, how does Africa fare in the Netflix imperial network? And I would say that there are some skeptics. Agina and Hadiga suggest that Netflix just wants to attract African viewers to watch its American content, not for African content, just to pull them in. And I think that mission is going to fail anyway, because Hollywood is relatively unattractive to the bulk of African film connoisseurs. And its highly specific templates and red tape are among the obstacles to African film distribution as well. Quality control is always good, but authenticity may be undermined by bureaucracy. And I think that's one of the dangers here. Finally, it has been pointed out, I mean, their catalog has been expanded. So you have the Wedding Party, Lionheart, King of Boys, and whatnot, on Royal, Swallow, just to give a little sample. I've seen a few of these. Um, the fact, though, is that it's the historical epic, I think, that could be the game changer in terms of African indigenous knowledge systems. Because the historical epic, if you look at Amina, which is one of the productions of 2021, it is a historical epic. It attempts to depict an aspect of Africa's past through a celebration of an indefatigable, unflinching female warrior of the 16th century in Zazzau, Nigeria. And I think it's historical epics such as Amina that really may provide a robust possibility for engagement with African indigenous knowledge systems, and even in terms of Afrofuturistic uh, possibilities. Never mind the stereotypes that, at least not so much never mind, but know that in some aspects of the Black cinematic world that, you would find on Netflix, you do have these soul characters and the Mamis and the Jezebels and the Sapphires and the Picaninis and whatnot showing up. These tropes may not automatically apply to the continental Africa collection that they have, but certainly gives food for thought when, and we have to be very cautious. But I would conclude that streaming platforms such as Netflix present some possibilities for engagement with Africa's past, and AIK in particular. But cautious, uh, caution and vigilance are key. There are some other platforms, and the only thing I would say here, because I think I'm getting a bit late, is that you do have one other area that I think the gaming platforms that may be useful. And so I mentioned Teddy Kosoko and his Maseka Game Studio. He plans to develop his own platform with the stated aim of promoting African history and culture. And he has actually developed several games so far, including Africa Journey, Kisoro, and Ninja Warrior. So, although it's not a major part of the presentation today, but I think the gaming platforms should also be noted. I am going to stop at this point and welcome questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gloria. That was fascinating and brought together so many thought-provoking threads. We have a few questions coming in the Q&A. While people are gathering their thoughts, I will just extend, maybe one or two to you. So you pose this very important question: can digital platforms project ancient African knowledges? And this made me think of the website that you founded. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what motivated you to create this, and what your experience might be able to tell us about the question you pose, and if it gives you kind of any advice for other content creators of Indigenous knowledges online.
Okay, so you're talking about the websites.
Yes.
Okay. Now, why I would like to, let's see, how do I get out of here? And all right, well, I'll just talk. I can't see anybody. The website, I did this website, or at least the original version, about in the very early days when websites just emerged, 90 something. And I was definitely determined to use this website to get people to, reflect on the different aspects of Africa's um, history and culture. And guess what? I also decided I would go learn HTML, which was the format, the language of that moment. And I did that. And so I actually, the earlier versions were, the earlier version was a site that I actually um, constructed myself. But I, of course, I didn't catch up with the with the new, technologies and website making, and so I had to sort of employ somebody, get a team to bring it to what it is at the present time. But I regret that earlier phase, because you see, in the earlier phase, I could jump on the website and make any correction right away. Whereas with this one, it's not that easy. I have to ask the producer to do this and do that, and so I feel pretty sad about that. But so that's the situation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So you're giving us a history of of platform change in a way. Let me just bring in an audience question, and I'll share another of my own, time permitting. So Brian Majorella asks, and forgive the pronunciation, does any sharing of African indigenous knowledge via platforms simply facilitate cultural appropriation? What predictions can be made regarding likely positive and negative impacts of such sharing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the whole question of intellectual property theft as such could also come in too. But again, we're looking at a, you know, complicated situation here. The choice is okay that you don't put the stuff up, right? And you just keep it under wraps in terms of, or behind some paywall, right? Or that you make it easily accessible with the recognition, you know, that possibility is there, you know, not just cultural appropriation, but also the intellectual property theft. But I think we have to make the information available and, you know, be aware of the consequences. The other option of just keeping it um, under wraps, I think, would simply mean that the information would never would be known only for to a very select minority. I don't know if I've answered this question.
Yes, thank you. I'm also reminded that you expressed a preference for questions being grouped together. So I will now do that now that I've remembered. So one question from me. So you mentioned that the AIKS framework could also apply to Native American knowledge systems as well. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, and in particular, kind of the possibility and limitations of different social media platforms for facilitating solidarity, collaboration across Indigenous knowledge producers from different world regions. I thought it was fascinating when you mentioned how automated recommendations can potentially help to, you know, segment users and prevent them from seeing content coming from elsewhere. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on, yeah, possibilities and limitations for transnational collaboration through digital platforms, is one question. And then Rita Lucarelli asks a fascinating question. What do you think about the monopoly of the English language on digital platforms and websites? Shouldn't linguistic plurality be respected also online? For a website of Egyptology, for instance, shouldn't we use Arabic too? So I will stop there and give you those two to respond to in any order you like.
Okay. Well, the Native American knowledge systems. I mean, for example, there is a I would say, very limited information um, from the general public. I would say almost deliberately so about so many aspects of Native American indigenous knowledge systems. I mean, the ball games, for example, the ball games, the soft drink industry, which of course was built on Native American knowledge systems, right? The medical world, in the context of the botanical, knowing the very effective active principles of so many different products. The pharmaceutical industry has been built on Native American knowledge systems, but they don't acknowledge it. And it's only if you begin to probe that you'll have it. So it's important to get this information out. Again, the cultural appropriation, question is there, and the issue is there. But again, we've got to get it out. I mean, I am so amazed at how few people know that the 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 basketball game, is something that we will see in the courts, the ball courts in the Central American ball courts dated to almost 2000 years BC. So would have so many, the hoops, etc., etc. So protective gear and so on. So it's very important for us to share information, and I think uh, that's one of the things I don't really appreciate with Netflix. But remember, we can sometimes make petitions and see if they could if we can influence them to change. We don't just want, I mean, African indigenous knowledge systems. I don't think we want a world where we are cocooned and uh, barricaded. We want a world where there is interaction. And so there should be links. And just as we have what I mentioned, the different aspects of African indigenous knowledge system, so too people should be aware of the other. And I think collaborative research is quite important, but the question is how would we get these digital platforms to, to, to recognize this? Because remember, they are for profit. I'm not so sure though that I have come across Indonesian. I think gradually people are beginning to, in different countries, are beginning to use um, their languages. But anyway, I have to be careful here. This is probably a case where there was a locally constructed platform. So the question is whether English should be a monopoly on websites, and I would say absolutely not. And I think the users have to keep reminding the platform owners that, you know, given the gains made in translation, we have to do better. But actually, let me just say that Google is working on, and we'll see whether this is all talk or whether it's real, but working on, in terms of Africa, on having various translation capabilities across African languages. And if they do that in terms of not only one region, but across regions, I think, that's the way to go. So I think that's something that may develop in time, at least in terms of those platforms that are not locally generated. We do have a few locally generated platforms. Thanks for that. And those are the ones that escape the um, over concentration on English. What was the other question?
I think that brings us up to date. So we have just a few minutes left. So I'll bring in one more audience question from Nico Natalia, who says, your presentation did a great job of showing how corporations like Google showcasing artistic and technological contributions from Mali and other parts of Africa still runs the risk of racist misunderstandings or mischaracterization of the history and cultural works. What platforms, if any, do you think could offer AIK not only exposure but respectful education around the work and African indigenous knowledge epistemologies? What digital spheres hold the potential to help a paradigm shift in how African indigenous art is viewed and understood? And that will probably bring us up to time. So I will leave you with that question.
Right. I've been thinking about that. Um, Let me just go to, I don't know if you can see this table.
Table,
No,
no,
you cannot. Okay.
would you
But
like, sorry, go ahead.
I have a table I made up with the various arts and culture, Google Arts and Culture, YouTube, and Netflix. So what I made a list of the triumphs for arts, Google Arts and Culture, and I said, okay, preservation of culture via digitization is okay, and the aspects of AIK visibility and visual possibilities, that's good. But the vulnerabilities are about the Eurocentric interpretations, cultural colonialism, and the surveillance. So, in other words, I didn't give arts and culture an A. I probably got I don't know, a C or something. YouTube, because the question is which do I recommend, right? YouTube, on the other hand, okay, empowerment of marginalized communities, you have user activism and all that. That's the plus, the triumph. But vulnerabilities, recommender algorithms are biased to extremists, and you have uh, surveillance, coexistence with white supremacist, Afrophobic, and hate ideologies. And so on the YouTube platform, you find yourself side by side with, competing with, you know, these negative things. But on the other hand, okay, you do have, the possibility of uploading some videos that may be positive and a few people may see them. The third, Netflix, I mentioned, okay, additional funding stream for Nollywood, new audiences and viewers and all that. And of course, the vulnerabilities would be the red tape specifications. And of course, the possibility that some of the videos chosen may be tampered with to suit the white male consumer or so. In other words, and I could go down the list. Well, we don't know where Twitter is going. we don't know the direction of Twitter. But I could pull out, Facebook and all of that. And in all cases, I see negativities, but a few positive things. So it's really hard to say, well, okay, this is the one that I highly recommend. There's none that I highly recommend. I'm sorry to say. Um, I was planning to do Vimeo, and if anything, I'm leaning to the Vimeo direction. I do have some stuff on YouTube, but I would probably lean to Vimeo, but at the same time, the vulnerabilities are there. The whole question of data acquisition and so on, putting you to work and you don't even realize it. You're doing unpaid labor. So I like the question, but it's not maybe we have to go make our own platforms, as I did with my website initially. I guess that's it.
Yeah, well, somehow it is already the end of the hour. I think this is just the beginning of the conversation. I personally would love to have an entire new talk from you about Twitter and content moderation, but that we'll have to save that for another day. So I would just like to thank you, Dr. Emeagwali, so much, and for your thoughtful presentation, and everyone who asked a question and attended this talk, which will be on YouTube. So it will live on a on one of the platforms that you mentioned. So just to make it yeah, that much more meta. So yeah, thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Halloween night.
All right. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.